Good evening from our headquarters in Kiev. This is the Sunday show at Hromadske International, the only English-speaking prime-time analytical program explaining Eastern European geopolitical storm in English, and I'm Natalia Humenyuk. This week, the government collapsed in Moldova. That was an unlikely coalition of pro-European and pro-Russian parties, but that would be in the second part of our program. But we're starting with another explosive events which taken place in Washington, D.C., but were directly connected to Ukraine, as there were the first public hearing in the Congress regarding the impeachment inquiry regarding the U.S. President Donald Trump, and the top officials from the U.S. Embassy here in Ukraine were testifying. That was the former ambassador Yovanovich, and as well the current Charge d'Affaires Taylor, as well as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, George Kent. We have also the testimony from the embassy's employee, David Holmes. But in order to join the discussion, we have the great journalist and analyst here. That's my colleague, Brian Booner, chief editor of Kyiv Post, our great friend and the publication, so follow Kyiv Post to know more.
Thank you for having me.
And as well, Carrie Hipko-Oderman, who is political scientist and media observer.
Thanks for having me.
So I think many people from our audience had, if not watched the testimonies, not everybody had the time for all full 5 hours of one and the other. But what do you think are the most important things of this week?
This was a tremendous week, not a good week for sleeping, because if you're in Ukraine and things are happening on the Washington time, you're up all night and you're trying to wake up in the morning to see what's going on in America. But this was fantastic. First of all, from a PR point of view, this impeachment hearing is brilliant. They first had the private hearings, then they leaked the private statements, then they leaked the private testimonies, and then they come with public hearings, and so we can reach the whole public testimonies. So it's great. They're really educating the public for those who are paying attention to what's going on. But in the end, so far, nobody is breaking party ranks. So if you really want the prediction, if they stick to just his crimes related to Ukraine, probably he will be impeached in the House, but he will not be convicted in the Senate so far, and so he will stay in office.
But I think that also, what do you think is, you know, you are both American journalists, but based here in Ukraine. But I think the audience outside of the country want also to know, you know, how that's seen from Ukraine. What do you observe?
I'd like to know how it's seen from Ukraine, too, because I'm missing this a little bit in the media. If we're honest, and we should be, President Zelensky said there was no quid pro quo. And I'm surprised that more Ukrainians aren't questioning his response. My only answer is because what President Trump did was business as usual here.
There is quite a mind-blowing quote from the David Holmes. I can keep the part of the statement, written statement in the impeachment inquiries. This is the employee of the American embassy here, and I want that our team play it for you.
I heard Ambassador Sondland greet the president and explain that he was calling from Kiev. I heard President Trump then clarify that Ambassador Sondland was in Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland replied yes, he was in Ukraine, and went on to state that President Zelensky, quote, loves your ass. I then heard President Trump ask, quote, so he's going to do the investigation. Ambassador Sondland replied that, quote, he's going to do it, adding that President Zelensky will do, quote, anything you ask him to. I then took the opportunity to ask Ambassador Sondland for his candid impression of the president's view on Ukraine. In particular, Ambassador Sondland agreed that the president did not, quote, give a shit about Ukraine. I asked why not, and Ambassador Sondland stated that the president only cares about the, quote, big stuff. I noted that there was big stuff going on in Ukraine, like a war with Russia, and Ambassador Sondland replied that he meant big stuff that benefits the president, like the Biden investigation that Mr. Giuliani was pushing.
So quite a big stuff. I think the headlines about the quote about President Zelensky in the U.S. media, less about the president doesn't give the S word about Ukraine. What we also make out of that?
Many things we make out of this. I mean, first of all, Ambassador Sondland is completely unprofessional. I mean, to call an American president on the cell phone in a restaurant when you're drinking wine. I mean, you know, it's insanity. Secondly, about whether Trump cared about Ukraine, I think Ukrainians have known and felt that he doesn't care, and he's ruined a lot of relationships that we've had across America. But third, I mean, to the impeachment, this is very important because it actually provided first-person testimony that Trump was only interested in whether this investigation was going to go forward or not. As far as Sondland, I think he was just talking, you know, to what your point is about with Zelensky. Listen, Ukraine needed that assistance. It's big money, and unfortunately, Zelensky was put into a box, I don't doubt that they were going to go through with announcing the investigation. If that was what needed to happen to get the assistance, I don't think many Ukrainians will blame him. But you know, he could have then killed the investigation later. So there's a lot of things going on with that exchange. But it was, I mean, it sort of highlights the rogue, unprofessional nature of Trump foreign policy, putting personal interests ahead of national interest, which is something that, well, he could be impeached for.
Well, I want to know where David Holmes has been this entire time. I had an interview with Sondland on the 26th of July, and just hours after that, he was on the phone after he told me how Ukraine was so important to the U.S. that he was then having this other discussion with this vernacular with President Trump. David Holmes heard this in July. Why was he only now telling Bill Taylor about it? It's been relevant since that day.
That's a very good question. I read the transcript, but he said basically everything has been coming in pieces. And remember, there's the two-channel thing, and the regular channel, I mean the official channel, was cut out of a lot of meetings and discussions. And then there was this unofficial channel. His explanation was he only realized that nobody else had reported what he had. Now, you can believe it or not,
I hope I'm
but
wrong,
that's
but
the way that's the way it goes. It seems to me in the earlier thing, he had said he had reported the conversation to the deputy chief of mission. I don't know what happened in the embassy. You got to remember that it was a very tumultuous time. As we know, Yovanovitch was yanked out unceremoniously, and Taylor didn't come for yet another month, so he was getting his feet on the ground. So it's not clear what transpired, but it's a very good question.
Well, this is conjecture, though. I mean, if he has this information and doesn't want to share it in light of Yovanovitch getting yanked, maybe our diplomats are really being intimidated.
Well, I believe that's true. One thing I want to know is how long Trump is going to let Ambassador Taylor stay in. He's a very good professional ambassador. He has won. I mean, you know, one thing, how this plays in Ukraine. I was looking on Ukrainian TV to see if this is like broadcast live. I didn't find any channels that would broadcast this.
We were translating all the time.
Good job.
Both of them,
I should have been on Hromadske.
Yeah, in Ukrainian, yeah.
But you know,
Yeah.
this was you know, Kent, Taylor, Yovanovitch are pretty much, well, depending on which news media outlets you do, are either heroes or they are just, you know, part of the deep state.
Before getting and providing some quotes also to go on, I probably will also want to mention, I just reread Gordon Sondland testimony today again, and it was very clear that he also, in that previous testimony, omitted the fact of this. So he said that there was a phone call with the president on the 26th of July, so admitted that, but said like there was nothing important in that phone. And also he said like, we didn't discuss investigation with President Zelensky. It didn't happen, which totally contradicts what Mr. Holmes is saying. So by the way, some people should look at how consistent is Mr. Sondland in his testimony under the oath. But let's also listen to, in particularly, Bill Taylor quote, also in particular on this call, which was the news of the week.
So your staff member over here is the president asking about the investigations, meaning Burisma and the Bidens in 2016. And Ambassador Sondland told President Trump that the Ukrainians were ready to move forward?
He did.
And I think you said that after the call, when your staff asked Ambassador Sondland what President Trump thought of Ukraine, his response was that President Trump cares more about the investigations of Biden. Is that right?
And Burisma, yes, sir. Ambassador Sondland said that if President Zelensky did not clear things up in public, we would be at a stalemate. He began that, again, by repeating, this is not a quid pro quo, but if President Zelensky did not clear things up in public, we would be at a stalemate. And what I understood in that meeting, the meaning of stalemate was the security assistance would not come.
So even though he said the words, there were no quid pro quo, he then went on to say, but the security assistance will not come unless these investigations are done. Is that what you're saying?
My understanding, that's what was meant by stalemate.
So you mentioned that it's not clear how much the Ambassador Taylor may stay here. Ukraine is already without the special envoy Walker. This position is over. Nobody would be instead of him.
It's unfortunate, but I think Volker went out damaging his reputation by getting involved, by wanting to be a political player and getting involved in the political interference or the political investigations that Trump wanted. Taylor, I'm worried because he's truly professional. I think, and I mean, the Republicans aren't really even disputing the facts. I mean, what they're saying is, so what? You know, so let's hope, I think Ukrainians and Americans should hope that somebody of Taylor's caliber comes in, and God forbid, somebody of Sondland's caliber does not come in to Ukraine, because that would be a total mess if the next ambassador to Ukraine was somebody who was just a Trump donor who knows nothing about the country. You know, it would not be good for Ukraine.
I don't think they can afford to do that, although we've been continually surprised. Over and over again. There's media fatigue about what could happen next. I don't know if Taylor's job is in danger. I understand why Kurt Volker resigned, because I think he knew what he was doing was wrong. And I think Sondland still doesn't realize that business practices don't transfer over to how diplomacy works. And I think he made some innocent mistakes. He made mistakes, but he thought he could use his same business attitudes in international diplomacy.
You mentioned you managed to interview Sondland when he was
I did.
here. So what were your general impression about him, apart from he sounded supportive?
He was extremely excited, and he was, first of all, extremely friendly and open and down to earth. He walked into the interview, he stuck out his hand and said, "Hi, Carrie, I'm Gordon." And I thought, okay, this is going to be a nice interview. And with hindsight, the people have been saying I was asking the right questions, but they were pretty easy questions. I asked him what he was doing here. And his answer was that he had the mandate from President Trump directly to be involved in EU-Ukraine-American relations.
Yeah, in hindsight, that's troubling by itself. But
But
I
we're
mean,
all,
but
you know-
you're talking about the surprise. I mean, who would have thought? I mean, you know, Donald Trump has broken all norms. Who would have thought he would live tweet insults to Yovanovitch as she was testifying?
That's
Take the
what,
phone away.
just to remind, that was a very, powerful moment of this week. And I particularly want you, the team run in particular this part of the Marie Yovanovitch testimony that we prepared.
Unfortunately, as the past couple of months have underlined, not all Ukrainians embraced our anti-corruption work. Thus, perhaps it was not surprising that when our anti-corruption efforts got in the way of a desire for profit or power, Ukrainians who preferred to play by the old corrupt rules sought to remove me. What continues to amaze me is that they found Americans willing to partner with them, and working together, they apparently succeeded in orchestrating the removal of a U.S. ambassador. How could our system fail like this? How is it that foreign corrupt interests could manipulate our government? Which country's interests are served when the very corrupt behavior we have been criticizing is allowed to prevail? Such conduct undermines the U.S., exposes our friends, and widens the playing field for autocrats like President Putin. Our leadership depends on the power of our example and the consistency of our purpose. Both have now been opened to question.
Ambassador, you've shown the courage to come forward today and testify. Notwithstanding the fact you were urged by the White House or State Department not to, notwithstanding the fact that, as you testified earlier, the president implicitly threatened you in that call record, and now the president in real time is attacking you. What effect do you think that has on other witnesses' willingness to come forward and expose wrongdoing?
Well, it's very intimidating.
It's designed to intimidate, is it not?
I mean, I can't speak to what the president is trying to do, but I think the effect is to be intimidating.
She knocked them. She slayed them. I mean, her calmness, her force, her reason, her logic, her facts were all on her side. This, and I think we've had the same feeling because I've seen you quoted in that she was very professional, very publicity shy. She was not going to go off script. She didn't seek the public limelight, but she was doing her job. And this all goes back to, I mean, I think the climax was that March 5th famous speech she gave at Ukrainian Crisis Media Center, where she laid out all the problems facing Ukraine, and a lot of them related to Yuri Lutsenko, then the do-nothing prosecutor general, and that ramped up the smear campaign against her that had her, taking the next plane home in May.
But it very also misogynic, this attack on Ambassador Yovanovitch. But also, what do you think? I mean, there was applause after her testimony in the Congress,
I think
which
that
was quite
surprised
unusual.
a lot of people. First of all, she's a 3-time ambassador. She is tested. She knows what she's doing. And I'm not surprised of her performance. It was fabulous. But she did her job, and she does her job well. That's why it's so surprising that she can no longer do this
I'm
job.
really worried about Ukraine now, though. I mean, we have a situation now where Zelensky has to beg. I mean, Ukraine is an important ally of the United States of America, and is fighting for democracy, not only for itself, but also for Europe and for America. And that's our policy. And they're not carrying out that policy. This is where the rogues got in and decided that they were going to wreck the store. Because while Zelensky has to beg to get into the Oval Office, Trump is meeting with Orban. He's meeting with Erdogan. He is, courting every dictator around the world. It's terrible. This is why, probably he won't be removed on Ukraine narrowly, because unfortunately, as we've seen also, not a lot of people know a lot about Ukraine in America. But that's why I heard this argument, that they should broaden it out. I mean, if he talks to Zelensky like this, what did he talk to? What was the conversation like with him and Putin, with him and this, the Saudi prince? I mean, it's with him and Erdogan. There's a lot here, and I don't know if America will get to it, but the institutions are at least trying to.
We also, probably worth it to mention that also during the Ambassador Yovanovitch testimony, there was Yuri Lutsenko, former general prosecutor, whom she, on record, on the oath, said was corrupt and is corrupt. He also, let's say, intimidated, writing that she's lying. Nobody, I won't say nobody, but there is very, very little trust into Mr. Lutsenko here. So people would joke. I guess all the journalists went to his Facebook saying oh, Good. So you started to comment on that. Can you respond on what you have done to this country with your meddling with Mr. Giuliani? But I also want us to to join to our discussion Michael Butsurkiv, who is a global affairs analyst and also who used to work in Ukraine here, but also commenting a lot on the American also media. Hi.
Michael, hello. Can you hear us?
Hello, everyone. Good to see
Hi.
you and hear you.
So, Michael, stay with us online, and probably my question as well would be: how do you think Ukraine is looking at this? At this moment, you are called by a lot of foreign media. We also sometimes asked by them, but a lot of Ukrainians here are concerned that Ukraine is looked like very corrupt. Then this is a PR disaster for Ukraine as well. The Ukrainian president doesn't look good in it. What is your impression?
Good to be with you. Well, with the exception of the Kiev Post, the coverage of this whole scandal has not reverberated very widely, I think, on Ukrainian media. And in fact, I've been in Ukraine for the past 2 weekends, and people do talk about it, but they're not obsessed with it, number one. Secondly, in terms of Ukraine's reputation, yeah, I think it's high time that the Zelensky administration lifted this cone of silence, or whatever you want to call it, and started fighting for Ukraine, for the things Ukraine believes in. Because I've been saying for the past few days and weeks, actually, that every time Donald Trump and his circle open their mouths about Ukraine, the word corruption comes up. Now, this can go on for a little bit, but it's gone on for far too long. When you think about the hard work done by agencies like Ukraine Invest to try and encourage, especially American investors, to come into Ukraine, they're probably now thinking, maybe I'll have second thoughts because Ukraine is a corrupt place, according to all these government officials. So my idea was this, I actually mentioned it in a recent CNN op-ed piece I wrote, is that perhaps the Ukrainian government, which, by the way, doesn't even have an ambassador in Washington at the moment, but maybe they can lobby for Zelensky to do what Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel did, and that is to appear before a joint session of Congress and approach Pelosi, ask her for an invitation, because, Bill Taylor, who I bumped into a couple of weeks ago, and all these guys keep on saying there's strong bipartisan support for Ukraine in Washington. If that is the case, let them invite Zelensky to Capitol Hill to give an address and talk about, really, number one, we do have corruption, we're fighting it, but don't call us corrupt. And then secondly, mentioning the importance of investing in Ukraine, but also thirdly, most importantly, about sticking with Ukraine in its fight with Russia. Because now that the Russians realize that Ukraine has no strong backer, benefactor, if you will, I think Ukraine is in a very vulnerable place. So very important for that type of support to be reiterated.
Mike, please stay online with us. I want to hear also the guests in this studio, the Brian Bonner, chief editor from Kiev Post, and Kari Hipko-Ureman, the political scientist and media observer. Also, how do you think the Ukrainian government can, and Zelensky in particular, can behave? I've heard all kinds of the comments, like stay away as much as they can, don't comment, because I think that everybody is very much concerned how to maintain this, trying to be bipartisan, not getting involved in the U.S.
Well, I think Michael has a good suggestion. However, that would be a complete turnaround from Zelensky not wanting to get involved with things in the United States. So I think you're going to have a lot of convincing to do. What would he say, though, if he got to that point?
Well, I just mentioned that there are really three things they need to say. Is number one, we need strong bipartisan support. We need support from the United States to press our war with Russia to bring peace. And as we all know, there's a big peace summit coming up in Paris on December 9th. Secondly, he needs to address the corruption issue, because again, I think and I fear that Ukraine is being unfairly tarnished in all of these hearings. So he has to come out and start defending the country. And then thirdly is that I think generally speaking, he can address, this whole scandal, and that we're not playing politics, we're staying out of the game. But I thought it's important to come here and reiterate to the American people directly via Congress of Ukraine needs your support through investment, through economic aid, and through military aid.
Well, maybe December 9th will be a nice time for him to practice when he's in Paris with this pitch, because he's going to have a hard audience there too.
Right.
That's going to be a little dangerous, yeah.
So what do you make of that? Do you think that the Ukrainian government had speak more on that?
Well, I think there's a lot of things going on right now. I think that Zelensky, if we see the investigations that are being opened up, and especially in the last week in the banking sector, I think Zelensky and the Prosecutor General Rybashapka are trying to show that that this is different. This is a different ballgame. They're taking action against corruption. Uh, Whereas, I mean, you're too kind to Lutsenko, little trust, no trust.
No trust.
He was a clown. 3 years, no prosecutions. He had to retract many of the allegations he made. He got in bed with Giuliani and Giuliani's associates. So he damaged the credibility with willing participants, which Jovanovic talked about. But I mean, I think that I like Michael's suggestion. I mean, I think bipartisan support is still there, is still strong, and they can do Congress can do the end run around Trump and invite him, to give the speech like Poroshenko did 3 years ago, I believe it was, in front of Congress. And then I think it's time for Zelensky to shine. But right now he's at this point where he's still relatively new. He needs to show results.
And also being new, maybe my question would be, there was a second call transcript published on the election night. Of course, it was softer. By the way, the Alexander Widman, who was a director, and the National Security Council said from the beginning in the testimony that the first call was very nice compared to the second. But could really he behaves differently? And maybe I think what's missing, I also would be curious also to hear also from Mike and you shortly. I think that a lot of people doesn't understand why Zelensky is asking and begging for this meeting.
Well, remember, he didn't think that this would be public. It's non-standard to release these kinds of transcripts. Yeah. The other point about the first call is, Trump said he was holding up the aid because he was so concerned about Ukrainian corruption. The word corruption does not come up in the first call.
Let's talk about corruption a little bit, though. Michael suggested that Ukraine talks about how it's fighting corruption, that it's not corrupt. Right now everyone is a Ukraine expert, and if you Google Ukraine corruption, you're going to have hundreds of hits on articles from journalists and maybe not so good journalists talking about what Ukraine can do. Has any of the advice been taken?
Well,
I think that's some being Michael.
Yeah. Look, talking about Zelensky's performance in the two calls, but also don't forget that what I call disastrous press conference on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly with Trump. I mean, I don't know if anyone coached Zelensky, but he came across, I think, with all due respect to the president, as a buffoon, as a comedian, and, joking around with Trump about when he's going to come to the White House. Look, every foreign leader wants a visit to the White House. It bestows status on not only the leader, but also the country, and it's very important for Ukraine. And I think it would also send an important signal to Vladimir Putin next door that, yes, we are tight with Ukraine, and we are here to stand by its side on all issues, economically, military, and so on. But I don't think he should fight for a White House visit at all costs, because Trump is reacting like a mafia boss. It's not easy to deal with someone with that manipulative as well. So there's a very important kind of strategy Ukraine has to follow. But first step in all of this, I think, in terms of dealing with the U.S. is, for heaven's sake, appoint an ambassador already to Washington. I heard from my Ukrainian diplomatic sources that they actually did have a short list of candidates, but there was such internal disunity on who to pick that they scrapped it, and now they're back at step one. So the rumor on the streets right now is that Ukraine's permanent representative to the UN is going to be shifted down the road to Washington, down I-95, and represent Ukraine for the time being.
What I know that the foreign minister Pristaiko said that they are waiting for the confirmation, and for us it's also the question why it takes so long from the U.S. State Department to confirm the Ukrainian, or from the American authorities to confirm the new ambassador. I think that unless the ambassador is confirmed, they won't really say who this person is, but of course this discussion is there. I want to ask another question, but probably Michael want to mention what was interesting for us when we discussed with the colleagues, that in fact that I think it looks like a hook, the fact that Zelensky had been invited, because that was added by the chief of staff, this sentence about invitation in the letter in the end of May was added by the chief of staff of President Trump office, not by the diplomats or National Security Council officials. At least that was also in the testimony of Alexander Vidman, that he didn't write that. Another question is like, what do you think it's okay and should the Ukrainian government and the prosecutor do with Burisma? Because in particularly, since it's everywhere in the press, it's clearly that there was a bribe to stop the investigations years ago. You can't really pretend that this is not there. And it's like a time to reopen the case, but as soon as it would be reopened, it would be considered that as if Zelensky had...
It's a very touchy thing. But as we know, and George Kent testified that basically he was told by General Prosecutor that it was closed for bribery. And he went in and said, how much? And the answer is $7 million. This is where the Republicans actually have the strongest argument, because the whole Hunter Biden thing, the whole Zlochevsky mess stinks to high heaven. It damaged Ukraine's credibility with international partners and law enforcement. It needs to be investigated, but it needs to be done in a strictly professional way. And we see, we all know with the oligarchic influence, and we see how much Burisma tried to buy influence. Kwasniewski, Hunter Biden, and legitimacy, giving $500,000 to the Atlantic Council. It's unfortunate, but people have got to. I'm glad all that came out, because it needs to come out. If people want to de-oligarchize, they have to stop taking oligarch money.
Michael?
Yeah, I agree with Brian. It was interesting in Yovanovitch's testimony that the point came up that she was actually coached by the State Department before she came to Kyiv on how to answer questions about Burisma. So that tells me that there already was a kind of acknowledged sensitivity about that issue. But look, I think the best way for them to go forward is to fry the big fish. I know it's very sensitive, but Mr. Kolomoisky is back, as we all know, and there is a lot of concern at the IMF and other multilateral agencies about what exactly Zelensky is going to do with him. So if he can be bold and move forward and retrieve those stolen billions from Privatbank and the other banks, that would send just an amazing signal at this point that Ukraine is serious about fighting corruption, no matter who it is. No one's untouchable, no one's above the law, and go after these guys. Maybe he needs to do also internal house cleaning in the presidential administration. I saw that quite flattering interview with Pan Bogdan in the Kyiv Post, but I think from everything I'm hearing, it's a big source of the problem here as well.
Okay, well, Michael said the K word. Yeah.
I'm glad you read that interview. Secondly, about that interview, it was 60 minutes, and he complained 12 times about the Kyiv Post during that 60-minute interview. I also had the chance to interview Rybashapka. And if you read between the lines, what he's saying is that he can prosecute anybody he wants. The political will is there, the capabilities aren't there.
Yeah, but
so this is, I read that to expect that you're going to hear investigations and prosecutions against second tier, but once you start going after the big boys, they have hundreds and hundreds of lawyers. They can jam the works of the state government. And you have to remember, from Rybashapka's point of view, you have 12,000 prosecutors. You don't know who's working for whom, who's working for the state, who's working for Kolomoisky, who's working for Akhmedov.
This is what I meant, though, about what has he done. Michael said the K word. So many people are suggesting that Zelensky clean house in his own presidential administration for the optics. Nothing's happening.
What do you mean by nothing happening?
When there are rules about lustration and formats are changed to compensate for certain hiring procedures, it makes people on the outside question, is everyone equal or are some more equal?
Okay, I think we're getting into the different side of the debate, but I want, like Michael, I want to thank you for being with us. I also would like to, because we have some other comments, what I want also suggest that we also have at Hromadske on our webpage en.hromadske.ua the short version of the transcripts with the most interesting details also connected to Ukraine from George Kent, now from you see the article from Ambassador Yovanovitch, as well from the Kurt Volker. So you can now, if you're following Twitter, you find the links, and And if you haven't had a chance, as any normal person, to read all these 2,500 pages, we have done that for you, and you can just stick to the short versions. But I want also to show a short comment which has been recorded in this studio a bit earlier by my colleague from Michael Weiss, who is the columnist and the writer for the Daily Beast and had to been here in Kiev some days ago.
Mr. Weiss, first of all, the public impeachment inquiry is beginning this week. Since starting November the 13th, we're going to hear a lot of testimony aired live. The first is going to be one by the acting U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor, and the deputy assistant to the Secretary of State, George Kent. And there's going to be a lot of other testimonies over the course of the next few weeks. So, what are you personally going to in these testimonies?
Well, I mean, the closed session testimonies, which have now been released, the full transcripts, 2,500 pages of statements issued by several U.S. diplomats and national security officials, that really kind of sets the agenda for the open proceedings. The most banner or blockbuster lines from those testimonies are going to be interrogated now in front of the Klieg lights for the American public to see. So I'd be looking for things like, Bill Taylor, for instance, reiterating his objection to doing this incredibly indecorous and possibly even illegal scheme whereby you're trading in political information in exchange for normal bilateral relations with an American ally, the so-called quid pro quo. Fiona Hill, who was full of insights, as I would expect her to be, as one of the best biographers of Putin. Some of the things that she said, in particular, the fact that Donald Trump will have been surveilled by the KGB starting in the late 70s, given his business ties and also his marriage to a Czechoslovakian national. These things are going to come up again and again. Also, keep in mind now, the Republicans who have every interest in protecting this president, they will have done their oppo homework, and some of the lines that they want to propound here, including trying to stand up the various conspiracy theories that Giuliani was trafficking in, this guy John Solomon, very dodgy reporter, quote unquote, for The Hill, who's now come under scrutiny. For instance, I would expect the Republicans to try and legitimize the conspiracy theory that it was Ukraine that actually engaged in cyber espionage against the United States in 2016, that the CrowdStrike servers are located somewhere here in Kyiv. And then indeed, Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, joining the board of Burisma, was guilty of all kinds of corporate malfeasance or is himself a corrupt individual.
Yeah, so you mentioned this a bit, that the Democrats and the Republicans will have differing strategies regarding the impeachment inquiry. So what will they be sticking to? For example, the Democrats will be doing their best, will be going out of their way to scare Trump to show that he's a bad guy, basically, and so and the Republicans, what are they going to do? How are they going to counteract this?
Well, so to me, the top line of this whole thing, and you notice the president is framing this as a witch hunt, as a coup, yet another attempt by the feckless Democrats to delegitimize the results of the 2016 election. That's been actually strategically savvy of him because his base shows no signs of fracture. The hardcore sort of MAGA Trumpkins in America are rallying around this president. In fact, that base is arguably even expanding. And any Republican who so much as questions the narrative is basically tossed out on his ear.
So that was the interview with Michael Weiss. You will have a chance later during the week to read or watch or listen the full interview of him on our webpage n.hromadske.ua. And to finalize our discussion, we have here Brian Bonner, the chief editor at Kiev Post, and Kari Hipko-Odeman, the political scientist and media observer based here in Kiev. I mentioned this was at the testimony of David Holmes, who worked for the U.S. Embassy here. He's explaining that he, together with the Ambassador Taylor, what he said, it became apparent that the energy sector reforms, commercial deals, and anti-corruption efforts on which we were making progress were not making a dent in terms of persuading the president in order to be engaged with Ukraine, which sounds kind of, pretty depressing that it doesn't matter what the policy of Ukraine is currently. It doesn't really make much sense. We discuss about that a lot. But what we should watch now at this stage?
Well, Ukraine needs to flex its muscles diplomatically worldwide as much as it can. Trump doesn't rule America. He's not everything. So the bipartisan support in Congress is still there, and it needs to be kept. So Ukraine must not surrender its sovereignty in these upcoming peace negotiations, and it must count on European allies. It looks a little shaky now. It's the same thing. You've got to win the war, both wars, against Russia and against corruption at home. And so Zelensky needs to do that too.
Yeah, there's this thing about flexing your muscles, though. I mean, if you go to a fight, who's going to jump in? And right now, Ukraine, they've got big friends in the Baltic, Poland sometimes. If he does a media offensive, what does he have to offer? Is he willing to test that? Let me ask you this. Would you change places with him? Because I wouldn't.
Now I see the enormity of his challenges, but it's doable. Everything is not in black and white. As we've seen here, Ukraine is making progress on a number of fronts, but it needs to show results because a lot of people have given up, especially after the disappointment of the Poroshenko years. So it's not going to be easy, but you have to go back to what the Ukrainian people want, and they were not going to surrender the Donbass or Crimea, and they are not going to surrender their ambitions to be a democratic, rule of law European state, and that is the strongest thing Ukraine has going for it.
I haven't lived here long, but if there's one thing I think you can count on, it's the Ukrainian public, really.
Right.
And I probably also say that it's true that in Ukraine currently there are different topics. We would also follow in our future shows. There were, the budget approved this week. There was
$50 billion.
There was the start of the land reform, which also discussed next week. Slow start on the next week. But as well, there was more or less a confirmation of the meeting between Zelensky and Putin in December. The Kremlin, though, didn't confirm the date of the 9th of December. However, it's going, and that's what is discussed here in Ukraine. And thanks a lot for being with us and for this great Ukrainian-American discussion. I'll be back in a second. We will go to what's going on in our neighboring country, Moldova, which you also need to care. But I would just remind that support Hromadske International. It's exactly this autumn we celebrate 5 years of our existence, and that's our story.
I would like us to be heard, not only in Ukraine, but all over the world.
No bread for 3 months.
Not one, but look how many. There's bread here and there.
You are going against the God.
Of course, point number one.
Thanks for the invitation.
When will this all end?
The number of political prisoners has grown.
Good evening from our headquarters in Kyiv. So, an unlikely coalition of the Moldovan pro-European Democratic Party, Acum Bloc, and the pro-Russian Socialist Party, PSRM, it was a pro-Russian leaning party, had collapsed on November 12th. That existed for a bit less than half a year. A huge hope for Moldova breaking with the oligarch rule. And in the end, there was a new Prime Minister voted, Ion Chichu. So that was a breaking point. The prosecutor office law, which hadn't been supported, was a breaking point for the coalition. And in order to explain how important is that, we have with us Alina Radu, who is the executive director of Ziarul de Garda, investigative Moldovan newspaper. Alina, good evening. Do you hear us?
Hello, I hear you. Nice to meet you.
So, Alina, But first of all, explain us what really had happened and why was the law on the prosecutor's office a breaking point for the coalition?
I think the breaking point was met a bit earlier when long discussions about anti-corruption, transparency, integrity were taking place between socialists and this pro-European coalition PAS, ACUM. So it was clear that it can't go any more further because socialists didn't like anti-corruption measures, integrity measures, and when the point came to the general prosecutor, there were candidates, there were commissions, but there was not a clear point of the socialist part on this.
So now the Socialist Party is describing the new government as technocrat-led. Is this an accurate description of the new cabinet? What we can expect from them, from the new government and the new prime minister, also regarding the geopolitical orientation of Moldova?
We can't say this is technocrat government because this government is quite politically formed. Mr. Kiku, the new prime minister, and 5 of his members of the cabinet are former councillors or advisors of the Socialist Party leader and country leader Igor Dodon. So you can't name this government technocrat. It is very clear that this is a socialist government, but also in this government there are few members from former Democrat Party who served former Democrat government. It's clear that we have a new political coalition between Socialist Party led by President and former Democrat leader Vlad Plahotniuc, who left the country, but his behavior is still seen in many actions of some politicians. So what to expect from this government? First of all, the government who just left, the government of Maya Sandu, was known as the most transparent government. We don't expect too much transparency in the integrity from the new government. Let's see, but there are many questions that are not answered. And what to say about the new agenda of the new government? It is clear that it is not very much pro-European and pro-EU standards because, let's say, the Minister of Defense is against NATO, against EU. We don't know what to expect. Most of the members of the cabinet are pro-Russian, and many of them have problems with integrity. So we expect a problem for Moldova, and we expect hard times for fight with corruption, the most needed now in our country.
But probably, Alina, can you explain as well, because the coalition between ACUM and the Socialist, that was a coalition, first of all, against the country's richest man, you mentioned Vlad Plahotniuc and his Democratic Party, who had usurped all branches of power. So is this move more or less coming, that it means that Plahotniuc is coming back to run and govern Moldova?
We can't say Plahotniuc comes back directly, but principles of oligarchy are coming back. Igor Dodon, the actual president of the country, started to control more and more media, and now seems he will control as much media as the former oligarch Vlad Plahotniuc was controlling. Socialist Party controls more than ever state institutions, and it means something related to oligarchy. So from the same point, media requests about transparency are not working. So what do we have? It seems we have a new oligarch in cooperation with the old oligarch.
So Alina, we'll follow the story. Thanks a lot for explaining. It's quite a big news for the Eastern Europe, and you should follow. You can follow that also on our webpage. Also, we republish a lot of stories from Diarul de Garda as well. Follow our newsletter. Sign up for our weekly updates. It's possible on our webpage ion.hromadske.ua. And with this, I say thank you from the entire team of Hromadske International, and follow us in social media. On Twitter, on Facebook, search Hromadske International. Also, you can listen the program on the podcast, so if you would like to listen the future and previous episodes. So with that, we say you thank you and goodbye.